When we're talking about weapons in space, no one is saying openly, "I'm putting weapons in space." Things that, when we do our analysis, we would say are suspicious are satellites that may release other satellites or release other objects at a high speed. Could look like a projectile, for example.
The Rational View is a weekly series hosted by me, Dr. Alan Scott, providing a rational, evidence-based perspective on important societal issues.
Produced by Soapbox Media.
The world needs evidence-based public policy now more than ever. Making the right decisions should not be partisan politics. Please help spread The Rational View by going to patron.podbean.com/The Rational View. Together, we can make a better future.
Clayton Swope is the Deputy Director of the Aerospace Security Project and a Senior Fellow in the International Security Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS. Before joining CSIS, Swope led national security and cybersecurity public policy for Amazon's Project Kuiper, an initiative to increase global broadband access through a constellation of satellites in low Earth orbit. While at Amazon, he also worked on cloud policy issues. Prior to his time at Amazon, Swope served as a senior advisor on national security, space, foreign affairs, and technology policy issues for a member of the U.S. House of Representatives. He also worked for more than 14 years at the Central Intelligence Agency, serving largely in the Directorate of Science and Technology. He holds a Bachelor of Science in Mechanical Engineering from the University of Notre Dame. Mr. Swope, welcome to The Rational View.
Thanks, Al. Thanks for inviting me to your show.
Thank you for coming. Looking forward to this chat. So your bio says you were a member of the CIA in the Science and Technology Department for like 14 years. That is cool. Did you get to make cool secret gadgets for the agents like Q?
Really, that's it's funny that part of my biography. It's not something that I normally talk about. I like talking about the time that I spent at Amazon and working for the member of Congress on the Hill, and then my time here at CSIS.
That's cool. So your bio says you're Deputy Director of CSIS, the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Now this, for listeners out there, should be distinguished from CSIS, the Canadian Strategic Intelligence Service, which is our equivalent of the CIA. Your organization puts out an annual space threat assessment, and that's what I wanted to talk to you about today. What information and evidence does your organization use to put this report together?
So we do not usually pronounce our acronym. We do say CSIS, so not to have any confusion with your intelligence service, but certainly it could be pronounced as CSIS as well. We do all of our research from open source. We do everything in the public domain. So sometimes that's really hard to get information on some of the topics that we're trying to write about. But there's a lot that you can find. We do have scholars who do have other language skills. So it helps us do research, not just in English, but in other languages that we're interested in.
Interesting. Now, other than pandemics and artificial intelligence going rogue and military drone swarms and catastrophic climate change, we have another fear to add to the pile: killer satellites. Give me the bad news. I've watched Val Kilmer in the movie Real Genius. Should we be worried about being vaporized by space lasers if we piss off the wrong people?
I think two ways to really bin threats in space and how we think about it. There's one group of threats that relates to systems in space or space systems generally. So we call those counter space weapons or counter space capabilities. Those would be systems that might work to deny our ability to use a service from space. So that could just be something like someone jamming GPS. It could also be someone using a missile to shoot down a satellite in space. So those category of weapons are really focused on disrupting our ability to use space broadly. I mean, another set of threats in space could be things that would affect us more directly here on Earth. Okay. So that group of threats would be just as broad, but it could also include things like the ability of an adversary to use a space capability to help what they do on land or sea or air. It might not be directly a weapon, but it might be enhancing their ability to conduct their operations.
Okay. So, before we get into the details of your report, maybe just a little background on what the legal and treaty framework is globally regarding weaponization and militarization of space. Like, is it illegal to put up, weapons in space? Or are there rules that say you shouldn't be doing this? I'm hoping there are.
Let me go back to the early days of the Cold War. You could look at this at a time where the United States and the Soviet Union were competing for spheres of influence.
Mm-hmm.
So, those spheres could be geographical. If you look at where the United States would try to establish, let's say a foothold somewhere, the Soviet Union would want to follow, and vice versa. So, in some ways, I would say it was about keeping up with the Joneses, and where one went, the other would go too, for fear of being outcompeted, for example, or out-influenced. And there was interest by both sides to place limits on where that competition could happen, particularly in areas where it hadn't happened before. So the first area that looked that way was Antarctica. So I would look at that as not necessarily it was an effort to have disarmament there, but more non-armament where it hadn't happened before, and to keep the Cold War out. So that led to a treaty in the 50s, and negotiating a treaty and signing a treaty by the end of that decade. And that emphasis was on scientific research and activities in Antarctica, and then really no military activities.
Okay.
So out of that mindset, the second area, and this is applicable to our conversation today, was really space, where there hadn't been that military element or that Cold War element of competition yet, in the same way that there had been in other places on Earth. So kind of out of that mutual interest in keeping outer space separate from most of the Cold War rivalry came the Outer Space Treaty in 1967. And really that's the foundational international treaty around space. It was modeled after the Antarctic Treaty. So really that was just an effort to limit something like colonial expansion or exportation of resources in space. But really, when it comes to military use of space, it does have some key provisions, but they're specific. So the treaty prohibits nuclear weapons or other weapons of mass destruction from being placed in space. And it's pretty clear about broadly banning military activities on the moon and other celestial bodies. So really, anything in space, any object like an asteroid, would be covered by that. But what it doesn't do, and I think this is important to know, what it doesn't do is prohibit putting weapons in space, conventional weapons in space, for example, or the military use of space. And another issue, too, that we see is that, you may say, oh, well, this sounds very semantical, but there's no agreement on what a weapon means in this context. So there's no agreed to definition of a weapon in space. So this treaty dates to 1967. This is a very long time ago, and arguably a lot has changed in space since then. We have a lot of new technologies that we wouldn't have had then. More involvement of companies in space. It's not just the government domain. More launch activity. A lot of different developments that just couldn't have been foreseen by people when they wrote that treaty, but that is still foundationally the bedrock, really, of international space law.
Now, as you say, space is. I'm a little bit worried that the treaty doesn't cover weapons very well. Obviously, nuclear weapons. It's nice that that's not allowed in space, but space is very important to us here on Earth. Obviously, GPS you mentioned as one vulnerable system of satellites that's up there, providing positioning systems that can be interfered with. There's communication. All of our global communications goes through geosynchronous communications satellites, and space is also used for imaging quite a bit for low Earth orbit satellites that pass over. And this has been kind of, I think, the foothold for military use is imaging and looking at potential adversaries and gathering intelligence on what they're doing. And that's not illegal. That's not defined in any of these treaties, I assume. Can you give us maybe a background on what militarization has been happening in space, over history? Obviously, there's these observation satellites, but what in the public domain do we know about militarization of space?
Well, kind of keeping in mind those two different ways or bins that we might categorize weapons in space, which I would separate from military use of space. So in the weapon categories, we have those that are more focused on Earth and those that are focused on a space capability, so disrupting something that we do from space. But when we say broadly militarization or military use of space, sometimes it's difficult to really discern how limits could be placed on some certain services or capabilities we all use from space. You mentioned a lot of things from positioning and location, but also time we get from GPS. You mentioned remote sensing, so taking pictures of things on Earth or even pictures of other things in space from space, and certainly communications. All of those things have a dual use and not only enable what we do as a society and economically, but also can enable defensive military operations. It's hard to separate. There are even more unique things that happen in space that also are dual use and hard to really separate when you don't necessarily know intent. So one example I would put there are efforts to develop satellites that could be used to remove space debris or remove satellites that no longer work from highly economically valuable positions in geostationary orbit, for example. So that would be an altruistic good thing to move those out of areas where they either could be harmed through being debris and cause a collision, or just taking up a parking spot where another satellite could be there providing internet to a large part of the world. At the same time, that capability could also be used for a military purpose. It could be used to latch on to a satellite in geostationary orbit, let's say a very expensive, exquisite government satellite, and move it to somewhere else. So prevent it from being able to do its mission. A satellite that, in one hand, the same satellite could have a purpose that most people would say that's a good, but then another purpose which people would say that's a military purpose. And it's hard to differentiate based on what it could do, what the satellite could do, what we see from Earth, what we can observe, without really knowing what the intent is of the operator. And that could change on a daily basis. It could be, well, one day, we have this satellite, and it's meant there to be removing satellites that don't work. But then in a conflict, this capability could be used in a totally different purpose, and the intent could change. And that might not even be because of any nefarious intent of that operator, but that's just what happens when someone is in the midst of a conflict and they're looking to use all tools that they can to win.
I see. So your report basically goes over various countries' capabilities or what they've been doing in space. So what have countries been doing? You mentioned that satellites have been shot down. This is obviously a very weaponized thing to be able to shoot down satellites. Who has these capabilities and who is obviously making use of them?
I think when people think about a counter space threat, and even if they don't use that word, when they're thinking about someone shooting down a satellite or taking some action against a system in space, they think about what we would call a direct descent anti-satellite weapon. So that's something that looks like a missile. It's shot from Earth and would be aimed at a satellite to blow up the satellite.
Okay.
Several countries have tested that capability, the most recent being Russia in 2021, which created a rather large cloud of debris fragments, which caused a lot of concern with astronauts on the International Space Station. There's also a space station from China now. So there are people in similar orbits that are affected by weapons tests. So that type of weapon, there are a number of countries that have it, but what we're talking about here is a missile that really would go to just a higher altitude than perhaps any other missile. And if we think about an intercontinental ballistic missile, that goes through space anyway. So this isn't something that is outside the realm to think of a lot of countries having access to, but really only less than a handful of countries have actually tested such a capability. So that's kind of the one that in many ways people think about when they think of anti-satellite weapons. Why these types of weapons are, I don't want to say they're necessarily not of interest, but maybe less fashionable, is because they create debris that could harm other satellites. So indiscriminate effects in the space environment. I mentioned the space stations and astronauts, but also thousands of other satellites in these orbits, which are usually pretty low. We call this low Earth orbit. So somewhere usually between 500 kilometers and 1,000 kilometers in space, but really low Earth orbit goes up to about 2,000 kilometers.
Right.
When we talk, just something interesting, when you think about geostationary orbit, which are a lot of communication satellites are, that's 35,000 kilometers in space. So it's a lot farther and harder to get to. So the for capabilities like debris generating missiles, there's a lot of international agreement that these aren't good to test. The U.S. had a moratorium on testing of those capabilities back in 2022. There was a UN resolution in 2022 where there were about, I think, 155 votes yes for that resolution against testing capabilities like that. But that's just the most obvious. Just kind of quickly, other capabilities and weapons that we see. It's everything from jamming and spoofing, which has become ubiquitous almost, of GPS signals around the world. We read a lot about the impacts to civil aviation and also maritime shipping. Cyber attacks, cyber operations targeting space systems, which don't necessarily even target the satellites. They could target something on Earth, infrastructure that controls a satellite, manufacturing facilities, launch facilities. We'd call those counter space weapons. And then kind of a third category that is more amorphous sometimes, and it is that dual use category of systems that could harm a satellite, but it's hard to know what it is really intended to do without getting in the head of the country or the company that operates the satellite. What we say, all we can generally say from open source is what we see we would call unfriendly behaviors in space. So a satellite from one nation may move near a satellite of another nation. And we call that maybe in an uncooperative way. So the one satellite is like, hey, I don't know what this satellite's doing. It's getting very close to me. Satellites in low Earth orbit move at about 17,000 miles per hour. So they're very fast. So you can make a mistake and cause a collision. And satellites usually don't get closer than, measured in kilometers, not meters. So anytime a satellite maybe gets within 50 kilometers, that's something that people are concerned about. And in an unfriendly way, we say, well, is that satellite meant as a weapon? Is it testing a capability that could be a weapon? Or is it just doing some effort to maybe take a photo of another satellite to figure out what that other satellite is and what it's capable of? Hard to say, but that's another category of capability that we track in a report, and that more and more countries are interested in similar things like that could have that dual use. Even though it's tough really to know without getting in somebody's head, is that really intended to remove debris, or is that meant as a weapon and a weapons test?
Okay. So what do we know about weapons in space? Like, are there any people that are openly putting weapons in space? Are we putting weapons in space that are, allowed by treaty?
I think when we're talking about weapons in space, no one is saying openly, I'm putting weapons in space. Things that, when we do our analysis, we would say are suspicious are satellites that may release other satellites or release other objects at a high speed. Could look like a projectile, for example.
Okay.
There are satellites.
This happens. People launch satellites and they spawn off little satellites that go off and do their own thing.
Russia does that in low Earth orbit. Another capability that we've seen, and something that we've seen reported in open source, and also what's interesting about the space environment is that it happens before our eyes. You have a telescope looking at the right satellite, and you can see exactly what it's doing. So one other example is a Chinese satellite a few years ago that latched on to a non-working Chinese satellite that's equivalent to GPS and moved that satellite somewhere else, and then came back to geostationary orbit. So something like that, again, altruistic, but could be used for military purposes to make a satellite that's useful, not useful anymore. So those kind of capabilities in space. No one is saying this is a weapon, but it has signs that it could be used for that. What you see a lot of, and so this is where, is this a space weapon? This is where I think, Alec, it does even to me. I'm like, I'm not sure where we draw the line. So we do see a lot, I mentioned, of, actually, we call this in our most recent report, which was released in April, we call this the normalization of deviance. So it's kind of three categories where we talk about, we just see this all the time now. One of those is GPS jamming and spoofing, or just generally jamming and spoofing of satellite signals. So that can happen by a capability on Earth, which interferes with your ability to use space somehow. That could be just as disruptive as putting a weapon into space. But is that a space weapon? It's a weapon on Earth that targets space. I mean, I could even think of a bunch of examples where I'm like, I don't know what that is. What is a missile launched? We talked about those weapons that generate debris. Is a missile launched from Earth towards a satellite? Is that a space weapon? What about a cyber attack targeting a ground station, which is how maybe a satellite communicates with the Earth? Or what about targeting the satellite? Is that a space weapon? I mean, something funny that I heard someone mention earlier this week is that, well, it's not funny, but I didn't know, was that I think up until early 2000s, all of the Soyuz capsules that the Soviets used and the Russians used, most recently for that's used for the space station, they all had a shotgun, a special shotgun that was intended for survival purposes, because the Soyuz capsules can land in Siberia. So that they could have to deal with the bear. And no kidding, it was a triple barrel special shotgun. Was that a space weapon? There are a lot of things that I thought about that I'm like, I don't have a good answer. It's worth thinking about. But I think, to me, if I said, well, what's the weapon? What's the ones that worry me the most? It's a weapon that could have indiscriminate effects and hurt the space environment in a way that we wouldn't be able to use space for a certain period of time. So that includes satellites in space, or something launched from Earth that could generate debris fragments, hundreds, if not thousands of debris fragments. You do that at the wrong orbit. You do that in geostationary orbit, that's going to last millennia. Right. And another weapon that could potentially do that, we don't see it now, but we've heard a lot in the news that Russia might be developing a nuclear anti-satellite space-based weapon that could have indiscriminate effects on the space environment in low Earth orbit. We don't have many details about that publicly, but we have heard from officials in the US who have said it could make low Earth orbit not usable for up to a year. So to me, a weapon like that is very concerning. So if that's huge, definitions aside, weapons that could make parts of space not usable, even if it's just for a month, I think we should be worried about that.
And especially like low-tech things, where countries that can't compete with our high-tech imaging and timing satellites, just denying those things in a conflict would be strategically likely to happen, I would think. And your mention of a nuclear weapon in space. So I think, people don't commonly know this, but people have tested nuclear weapons in space before. There was, I think, the Starfish explosion back in the 60s, where the U.S. launched a nuclear weapon into space and blew it up. And this thing, I think it filled in some of the Van Allen belts with electron radiation that basically made certain orbits inaccessible from all that radiation for years, as you mentioned. So, yeah, that's really a concern, I guess. If a conflict would break out, you could expect something like that would happen. Is that reasonable to expect?
I think I look at the incentives for countries to use or not use a capability like that. So what I include in that algorithm in my head, how much does that country depend on space for its national security, national prosperity? So that includes economic as well as military. So I think an indiscriminate space weapon, the U.S., it feels like it doesn't make sense. So from a national interest standpoint, the U.S. relies on space economically and for joint operations, for military purposes. China, I mean, that's the second most capable space power today. They have astronauts in space now. From a national interest standpoint, economically and even militarily, it feels like China's probably there with the United States. It would really, really hesitate to use a capability that could make parts of space not usable, because it would have serious impacts, long-term impacts potentially, on not just if there was a conflict going on, but for their economic prosperity. I start to wonder about Russia, though, which is really a shadow of its former self in space. It still maintains robust launch capabilities. It does have counter space capabilities, but from an economic standpoint, from a really national interest standpoint, you have to wonder if they care about the usability of space as much as the US and China would. You saw in Ukraine where it seemed Russia was even using Starlink, a US low Earth orbit internet system, for their communications. Their equivalent to GPS, there's 24 satellites. They're almost all past their service life and failing. And you don't really see much of an interest in China or in Russia in manufacturing a lot of space technology. Part of that just is due to their lack of the high-tech components that go into that. And it's weird, but it looks like their strongest space customers now are Iran and North Korea, and that's concerning because Iran and North Korea really, they're going to be providing Russia munitions and weapons for use in Ukraine, and they don't have anyone else to buy space technology from. No one else will sell it to them. So it's kind of concerning to see so much interest right now of a relationship between Russia and North Korea and Iran. Russia's already built a satellite for Iran and launched it. So it's kind of suggests that the way that Russia views space is different than the United States and China. And I'll include India in there too, who has growing ambitions in space, wants to launch crewed missions into space very soon, economically sees a lot of potential in space. So when I think about those type of weapons, I don't think anyone would use them. I worry it's where there's that imbalance, the imbalance in the force, if you will, for the desire to really use space for their broad national interest. And if there is an imbalance there, I would worry what that means if that nation with that imbalance had such a capability that really could have those indiscriminate broad effects on space.
Yeah, that's definitely a good way to think about it. So maybe I shouldn't be quite so worried about that. But debris, as you mentioned, is a risk, and in fact, they call it the Kessler syndrome, where we have runaway debris generation. There's so many things up there in particular orbits that eventually there's going to be a collision, just statistically speaking, and those orbits will become unusable as the debris cascades exponentially and just breaks up everything in those orbits. And so you've mentioned that debris capturing, or satellites that capture other satellites, have these dual uses for military. So that's interesting. But I think in terms of what people should be worried about and what groups that push disarmament or de-weaponization of space are concerned about, obviously it's very difficult to define what a weapon is. So what efforts are being done in terms of demilitarizing or de-weaponizing space, and what are there international treaties being proposed to maintain a clean environment out there?
I think before February. So February was when the revelations broke that Russia might be developing a nuclear capable anti-satellite weapon. So before that, if there was an international focus on controlling or limiting certain types of space weapons, however you define space weapon, that was focused on ones that could generate debris. So specifically on those direct descent anti-satellite weapons, which are missiles in effect launched from Earth towards a satellite. So at the spearhead was the United States, which said, hey, we're not going to test weapons like that anymore. That was in April 2022. And then nations signed up to say, we're not going to test that either. And then that culminated in that resolution at the UN, where nations said, hey, we think that's a bad idea to test these weapons. Just want to note, 3 countries, though, that either abstained or voted against that resolution was China, Russia, and India. All 3 nations that have tested that kind of capability in space. So there is broad international agreement that that's something that maybe isn't good, testing. The resolution did not, and the moratorium in the US did not relate to use, but you got to start somewhere. I would say after February, a very US focus with international partners effort to prevent Russia from using or finishing and deploying a capability that could put a nuclear weapon into space. There was a resolution by the US and Japan that reaffirmed that ban on putting nuclear weapons into space in the Outer Space Treaty. Russia vetoed it. So there's also efforts, which I think I would say might be a distraction from Russia, to say we need to ban all weapons in space. So sometimes there appears to be maybe a cat and mouse game between the US and Russia, but maybe in some ways they're talking past each other. Certainly everyone has their own interests. So it's tough to tell where kind of that genuine interest, particularly from Russia, given their decline in space, where it might be to limit space weapons. But there is a debate on what type of, what would that limit look like? How far would it go? The definitional questions that seems to be going on to a certain degree between the United States and Russia, with some participation from China. Will this lead to any kind of meaningful arms control? I think the jury's still out. It does feel like more of a sometimes just effort to show posturing on this issue before a diplomatic audience. And it's tough to say how in either case, either diplomatic pressure from Russia or diplomatic pressure from the United States would really affect the outcome. Because to me, the balance is off for the interests of pursuing these type of agreements. So I think without having that balance, those balance interests, which really undermined a lot of the nuke arms control efforts throughout the Cold War, where both sides saw value in an agreement, both sides being the Soviet Union and the United States. And that is really foundational to even the Antarctic Treaty, which we talked about at the beginning, and then the Outer Space Treaty, where both sides saw interest in that. So unless that balance can be found, I think it would be very hard to see how anything meaningful will result out of all these efforts. And now, instead of it just being really the Soviet Union and the United States, now it's the United States, it's Russia, it's China, and it's India, plus a bunch of other countries that you point out, Al, that could maybe have a capability in space that could cause a big impact, but they might not even have a space launch capability. They might just have cyber capabilities or jamming capabilities. And how do you roll that into the discussions too, where it's just a very multilateral effort, not so focused on just two countries? So a lot of challenges here to really figure out where a path forward is. But it seems to me maybe that area where those weapons that do have those indiscriminate effects, those seem to cause the most interest globally, internationally, and the most concern, as we all kind of recognize our growing dependence on space. So, if I got a vote, if Clayton got a vote, that's probably where would be a good place to start, and looking for support on something like that, particularly from China and India, who'd have just as much interest and just as much aspirations for space in a lot of different areas for their national prestige and interests as the United States, and to a way less degree Russia, which I find it would be very difficult to find that kind of path forward with just you're working with Russia.
Sure. And you mentioned that this is probably just posturing, and I think one of the reasons is that there's really no way to monitor or enforce these rules, as far as I'm aware. Like, how is there any way you would know if someone had put a nuclear weapon in space? Even like how you could maybe look at gamma ray emissions or something from spacecraft, but I would think that it would be very problematic to try to enforce anything. So that's maybe why not a lot has been done. Is that an understanding generally?
I struggle with the verification piece as well. I think when you go back to the 60s, when the Outer Space Treaty was established, I think the assumption was that, well, we'll just see something launch into space. So we'll kind of have a sense of what's going on. But now when you have, just last year, you have over 100 launches from the US, you have over 60 launches from China, you had 30 launches from Russia. All those numbers are probably going to increase. Not sure about the ones from Russia, certainly the ones from India, probably Europe too. It's harder to keep track of what's in space. And then once it's there, other than its behaviors, where it moves, and maybe what it's looked like, it goes back to that intent too. So even without your question, Al, about can we tell if it has a nuclear device on it, there are so many other things too that would have to go into kind of that ability to really proactively monitor and verify that in and of itself is a huge challenge. But rather than just stopping, discussions on this because of that challenge, I would think, an approach would just be: is there a way to find common ground between those interests today that have the most to lose from a disruption to space? And that's China, India, and the United States. Is there a way to find common ground to say, we think these things are good, we think these things are bad, even if it's just what I might call rules of the road for space? So how satellites and spacecraft behave in space and norms of behavior. That feels like a good place to start, because we don't have that even today. You
traffic
see another
control,
domain,
right, is the problem.
Or traffic management, traffic control, whatever you want to call it.
Tens of thousands of objects up in there, and they're all there's no air traffic controller that's monitoring them. Like NORAD tries to monitor these things and give out like collision warnings to satellite operators, but if someone maneuvers their satellite without telling anyone, then its position will change, and it could easily cause a collision. So definitely there's, I think, interest in space situational awareness and tracking these objects and figuring out where they're all going. So I think that's definitely something that's ripe for an agreement. But
yeah, I think you're right.
One other question I have, now that companies like SpaceX are now the source of most of the objects up there, Elon Musk has launched thousands of satellites into low Earth orbit. Are they under any obligations? I mean, I guess they're under the obligation of the country they launch from. Is that what the treaties suggest?
So the Outer Space Treaty, it has a provision that the signatories have to authorize and continually supervise their national space activities. That includes non-governmental activities, so commercial activities in this case. So the treaty, even in 1967, did kind of have a very forward-looking mindset where it envisioned a world where there were companies, private sector, doing stuff in space that was not operated by the government. Mm-hmm. So part of the way that happens right now in the United States, at least, is through, in effect, the Spectrum licensor, which is the Federal Communications Commission. So when the Federal Communications Commission looks at an application for a satellite provider, which uses spectrum for a lot of purposes.
This is radio frequency spectrum that is used to communicate to satellites from the ground.
Exactly, Al, yeah. So if they use radio frequencies, they need a license from the FCC in the US. So the FCC does have requirements that relate to, they'll call orbital debris mitigation plans that an operator has to submit. So that's one way that right now the US is trying to make sure that satellite operators, and when we talk about operators like SpaceX, we'll usually call that a constellation. So a constellation operator, to your point of SpaceX, they have over 5,000 satellites in orbit right now.
Wow.
And the FCC, through that licensing process, that's one way that the U.S. government at least gets a chance to take a look at what's happening to make sure it's being done. And I would call this in a safe and sustainable way for the space environment.
Yeah, I know astronomers have been bothered by all of these thousands of satellites going through all of their images with their expensive telescopes of deep space. You basically can't avoid SpaceX satellites streaking through your vision. So I think SpaceX decided they would paint their stuff black so it wouldn't have such a big effect.
They are definitely looking at ways to mitigate those effects. But what I think, it's interesting, to your point, this is a company. You always have to think about what's happening in a C-suite, what's happening with the bottom line, and how does this work from a business case? How can we close the business case? So it's finding that balance between, let's figure out a way to address this issue from astronomy, but with a satellite, you're also always thinking about weight and size and power, and all of that costs more and it's harder. And now you have more parts, and you have reliability issues, and you kind of have a domino effect, a cascading effect, where even small changes, even just the paint, can really impact what the business case is. Does that can we make this work anymore, or can we just not offer this service? Which arguably something like providing global broadband access to close the connectivity gap, that's probably a good. So there are just many competing interests that kind of have to go into that calculus somehow to make sure that, I'm going to say the right answer in quotes, the right answer comes out of that and tries to take into account all those different like stakeholder impacts in a way that can let this move forward, or maybe not, or just kind of find wherever that compromise is, which maybe everyone's not happy.
Does space have room for these constellations of thousands of satellites? Is this something that's going to blow up on our faces?
You probably heard it, Al, before. Space is very big. I think one way to look at it is if you have a highway or a road, how many cars can you fit on that road? It's a question we don't necessarily think about. If the car is moving at a certain speed, well, what's the safe distance? How many could be in that one section of highway at any one time, moving very fast? I think I mentioned satellites in low Earth orbit are moving something like 17,000 miles per hour. So I think this concept of how many can fit in a certain area is one that we should think about being based on technology and how we fly satellites. So if you could do it in a way to put more cars on a highway to make them closer together through something maybe that technology enables, I think you would have a different answer than if it was just based solely on a human driver. So how do you implement ways to fly satellites at maybe I would say machine speeds and not human speeds? It's probably the best way to look at how to make it work and figure out what's the right amount of satellites. And it's really hard to do that analysis right now, but it's probably something important to do, to kind of think about all the different factors that would go into that. Because you do it wrong. And I think you mentioned earlier, Al, the thought of a collision. And I mentioned that with regards to certain type of weapons and how they would really have effects that could impact a lot of different satellites. You want to kind of think about what that amount of satellites looks like in terms of those effects too on a bad day if there is a collision. I know right now we think we could avoid a lot of collisions, but there's always the risk, which means it could happen. And we have to think about kind of what the aftermath would look like and kind of find out if that notion of how many satellites is too much kind of factors into that final equation.
Now, it has happened. There have been satellites that have collided with each other and created debris fields just by accident. I think it was like there was a defunct Russian satellite hit an Iridium satellite, wasn't that?
Right. Yeah, so they happen by accident. Another thing that happens that generates debris is sometimes one satellite, there's a malfunction, maybe with a propellant tank, or sometimes it's hard to know, but something explodes and generates debris in space. And then there's the intentional ones that we've talked about with space weapons. So a lot of ways that debris can get generated. One thing I think that's interesting, it really depends on the altitude. So if you look at where the Russian test in 2021 took place, it was an altitude low enough that at this point, and that was only in 2021, most of that debris has deorbited and burned up in the atmosphere. If you look to another test, it was China's anti-satellite test. I think it was 2007. That was only about 300 kilometers higher in altitude, but 75% of that debris, so something along the lines of 2,500 pieces of debris, are still in orbit. And that 300 kilometers made all the difference. Like that's how much your location in space matters to how long it would take for something to naturally, it basically falls into the atmosphere because of drag. So depending on where collisions that happen above that, 1,000 kilometers, 2,000 kilometers, or certainly in geo, I think I mentioned that could last for thousands of years. So where a collision happens, no matter what's the cause or what kind of debris causing an event, really matters for kind of the what happens to the rest of the space environment.
That's cool. So we're getting towards the end of our slot. I'd just like to ask, what's on your mind? What should we be looking for? What interests you in this regime, and where are you looking at for what's going to happen next?
When we all talk about military use of space, I think we have to recognize that really anywhere that humankind has gone on Earth, it's usually because of economic interests. And it's hard to think of a scenario, a domain, or an environment where there then wasn't a desire of a nation state to protect its people, its economic interests, commercial interests. And then you have national security, defense, military interests that follow. I don't know how we would prevent that trend if we really envision a future where there are people living not just in orbit, in space stations, but on other planets, on the moon or beyond. And I think it's something that we just have to figure out where do we acknowledge that that's probably in some way going to happen, but at the same time recognize the greatest threats really to our ability to have national prosperity, economic prosperity, value for society in space. And that's where I kind of land on those weapons that are indiscriminate and have long-lasting impacts. There has to be a balance somewhere with nations and countries and nations who want to go into space and have people live in space, or even companies that want to have people living in space, to see that just like the reasons behind nuclear arms control, there are similar reasons to look at certain types of space weapons differently than just military use of space. And that's where we should probably draw that distinction. And the only other thing I think I'd mention, Al, that is certainly on my mind is what I refer to as kind of that normalization of deviance, of certain types of counter space activities that feel like they're just happening a lot. And what the impacts are, not just on, let's say, a conflict of counter space capabilities like that, which I'm going to say is things like cyber attacks, jamming and spoofing of signals, particularly GPS. And then kind of these behaviors of satellites, which we're scratching our heads like, what does that mean? How do we really figure out, do we need to defend against that? Or is that not something that we should worry about? Kind of those categories, I think we have to figure out what makes sense there, and where enough is enough, and how to maybe either draw a line through some kind of international consensus or figure out a way to deter, because that's not good if you have these activities that are really spilling over and impacting civil and commercial life globally, and not just in one area, or certainly impacting collaterally people who aren't involved in the conflict. That's probably also something that when we should be thinking about how best to kind of put a brake on, and make sure that in a year from now and in 2 years from now, I'm not adding more things onto that list of normalization of deviance, or the impact isn't even growing beyond what we've seen in the last year and the last few years.
Very good. Well, thank you so much, Clayton, for coming on the show and talking to us about this topic. It's definitely a topic of interest that people, I think, should be aware of and really don't think about very much. So more public interest in this sphere, I think, is good, and spreading the information about what is really going on can maybe mitigate fear and help people to have good conversations about this, which is what this podcast is all about. So thanks very much for spending your time with us. Really appreciate it.
You're welcome. And thank you, Al, for being interested in this topic. And I hope your listeners also found something useful and new in the things that we talked about today.
If you'd like to follow up with more in-depth discussions, please come find us on Facebook at The Rational View and join our discussion group. If you like what you're hearing, please consider visiting my Patreon page at patron.podbean.com/therationalview. Thanks for listening.